Okay, well, good evening, everybody. On behalf of the Ho Centre and our co-sponsors, the Department of Religious Studies, it's my pleasure to welcome you this evening and to introduce our speaker. It's always a source of pleasure and pride to welcome back one of our own to Stanford. Professor Nicholas Witkowski graduated PhD here in our program in 2015, and he had come to us from previous training at Columbia and before that Amherst. And after graduating went on to a postdoc at the University of Tokyo and then to 4 years at Nanyang Technological University in Singapore. And recently he's left that position to take up another one at the University of San Diego in the Department of Theology and Religious Studies there. So we're very glad to have him back on this side of the Pacific and to continue to follow his progress. Nick's dissertation was on the ascetic lifestyle in the early Indian Buddhist monastery, and he's gone on to deepen and extend that field of interest into looking particularly at questions of political power and caste and class, and that forms the centre of his research project now. He's the author of a number of articles and various book projects in process to the publication of which we are looking forward eagerly.
Me too.
But these things take time, and I know that purification of the Buddha field is really the process.
It's happening.
But anyway, there's quite a lot in the pipeline which speaks to his interests, and he's going to be talking about that area tonight in a talk entitled "The Corpse as Nodal Object for Thinking about Ascetic Practice in Relation to Labour in the South Asian Death Economy." So welcome, Nick. Look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Well, thank you so much, Paul, and thank you to Irene and Paul and everybody else for the invitation. It's wonderful to be here. Can anybody hear me? No problems, right? So the talk I'm going to give tonight, I'm going to be reading most of it, is about the corpse as nodal object. But this is related to some of the research I've done before. Some of you may have seen videos or read some of the work, and so I hope that there's not too much repetition. I've tried to eliminate most of it and do some serious thinking about one particular Vinaya case, which will form about 50% of the paper. So for some of you, this will be the beginning, will be kind of a prologue, which you've seen before, and then hopefully the last 50% should be totally new. So I have been asking myself the question for a long time of what it means to be an Indian ascetic. Let me just get myself started here. More specifically, what does it mean to be an ascetic in the Indian Buddhist context? In previous talks and publications, I've been critical of the classic formulation, which is essentially a Buddhist ascetic is like an Indian ascetic, but more moderate, less interesting. I've argued that this type of definition emerges from a bias in Buddhist studies in favor of soteriological explanations for why Buddhists do what they do. Today, I'll develop this argument further with an attempt to define, by way of taxonomy, what Indian Buddhist asceticism looked like on the ground, as it were. I would argue that the galvanization of scholars to historicize pre-modern ascetic life rather than rely upon soteriological discourse begins in earnest with the work of Peter Brown. Brown's approach to making history out of hagiography showed scholars how classic conceptions of the ascetic as a gleaming religious virtuoso might be integrated with everyday accounts of the socioeconomic life of late antique Rome. Although many have followed in his wake in the study of the ancient Mediterranean, scholars have struggled to piece together a history of South Asian Buddhist ascetic life that truly marries the hermeneutic frame of Homo religiosus to that of Homo economicus. The most well-known exponent of this approach in Indian Buddhist studies is Gregory Chopin, and he has opened the eyes of many to the concept of the monastery as a business. According to Chopin, if the Buddhist monastery was to succeed financially, it would be forced to bow to the Brahminical purity norms reshaping the South Asian political and religious landscape. However, the categories of the ascetic, the meditative, the ritual, and even the religious itself are often portrayed in his work as mere epiphenomena of the economic imperatives that really drive institutional growth. Belief is a farcical distraction from the structural realities of economics that really drive institutional power. Although I'm deeply sympathetic with Chopin's approach, I still find myself returning to Brown's more balanced scholarly narratives, a balance that tries, I think, to take homo religiosus as seriously as homo economicus. So, part one. Today I'll be trying to situate a set of Indian Buddhist monasticisms, often cataloged in Buddhist sources as Dutta-gunas, within the socioeconomic context of late antique South Asia. As many of the Dutta-gunas are difficult to situate socioeconomically, I have focused on a set of asceticisms that cluster around the discourse of a particular locale in South Asia, the Shmashana, or cremation ground. I've been interested for some years now in the extent to which cremation ground Dutta-gunas are a product not of Buddhist soteriology, but of non-Buddhist socioeconomic realities. In this talk, I'd like to frame these discussions of cremation ground asceticism within the broader the broader South Asian cultural construct of corpse labor. How does the centering of labor connected with the corpse help us to better understand the social worlds occupied by ascetic practitioners in late ancient South Asia? To answer this question, I will focus on one particular Dutta-guna that seems to have been central to the life of the cremation ground ascetic, that of the Pamshakulika. In the context of the cremation ground, the practice of the Pamshakulika was either the stripping of funeral shrouds from a corpse, or the gathering of fabric strewn around the cremation ground for the purpose of weaving it into a new monastic robe. In my 2017 piece, Pamshakulika as a Standard Practice in the Vinaya, I argued that the relationship of the cremation ground ascetic to the dead was conditioned by two competing ritual attitudes in late ancient South Asia. On the one hand, the decomposing corpse was laden with impurities that made this object anathema to the living. The corpse was thus to be abjected from the world of the living as soon as possible. On the other hand, the living were ritually indebted to the dead ad infinitum. Crucially, each corpse in the cremation ground remained a locus for the spirit of the ancestor for an extended period of time after death, and this fact generated enormous anxieties for the community of the living. In that piece, I concluded that precisely because of the sustained interaction of Pamshakulika ascetics with the corpse, the general population would come to view them as ritual specialists, capable of negotiating relations between the living and the dead. At that time, however, I didn't question my basic assumption that the identity of these cremation ground monastics was essentially Buddhist. I simply argued that this monastic clique of ascetics constituted a substantial presence within the institutional life of the early Buddhist monastery. Today, I will argue in contrast that the Pamshakulikas are a monastic group whose role is defined by their economic and ritual labors, and not a soteriological project, a nirvanic project, if you will. Second, I will argue furthermore that their roots do not seem to be in the mainstream Buddhist monastery, or perhaps in any Buddhist monastery at all. Rather, the ritual and economic functions of these Pamshakulikas perform suggest these figures are defined first and foremost as subalterns, or speaking in terms of the nascent caste system, as Dalits, operating as laborers within the late ancient South Asian death economy. Before jumping into the paper, I'd just like to highlight a couple of the primary sort of methodological approaches that I've been utilizing in order to articulate the contours, historically that is, of the variety of Buddhist monastic communities which appear in this record. and some of the new historiographical axioms that these approaches have generated. First, and most generally, I found that the study of asceticism, far from being a kind of backwater of Buddhology as it often is treated, is enormously useful for considering not only the range of practices that constitute monastic life, but also for illuminating the relationship of the Buddhist monastery to other religious, social, and economic constituencies in late ancient South Asia. Second, I have found that the Buddhist legal codes, or Vinaya, are an extremely fruitful terrain for examining these so-called ascetic practices, because the Vinaya often avoids standardized or canonical definitions of what constitutes ascetic orthopraxy. The bulk of today's talk will focus on Vinaya legal narratives. Third, the dynamic nature of both political and religious change in late antique South Asia should compel us to treat Buddhism as an emergent social phenomenon. In other words, I believe we should approach each text as a form of vernacular Buddhism, not presuming all Buddhist institutions expected orthopraxy or orthodoxy. I try to make this point today in that I will argue that cremation ground duttagunas were generated not by Buddhist monasteries, but by subaltern groups connected with outcast spaces in the death economy. I'll argue that the Pamchakulika asceticism is related to what we think of, is unrelated to what we think of as classical Buddhist soteriology. All this is to say that I've come to think of Pamchakulikas as only nominally Buddhist. In practice, they operate as what I will call a subaltern governmentality. I'll focus on two sets of social practices that define their identity. One is an economic logic, the other one a ritual logic. I'll be discussing two Vinaya passages today which feature rules for Pamchakulika cemetery ascetic communities. However, the bulk of today's discussion, as I mentioned, will focus on a case about one of the most notorious of these Pamchakulikas, a monk named Black Ananda. Finally, in keeping with the theme of vernacular or emergent Indian Buddhisms, I will suggest that Pamchakulikas are not performing ascetic acts recognizable primarily as Buddhist. Rather, their asceticism should be understood primarily in terms of the South Asian cultures of caste emergent in the turn of the Common Era. That is to say, their economic role of scavenger on the cremation ground and their ritual role as what I will call a spirit medium are most likely to have been innovations to Buddhism, imported and adapted into Buddhism by subaltern monastics, for whom impurity vocations on the cremation ground would have already been a way of life. Part 2. The classic loci for the study of Buddhist ascetic practices, or duttagunas, are texts like Buddhaghosa's Visuddhimagga. The discursive grain of these type of texts encourages modern scholars to view cemetery asceticism solely through the lens of soteriology, through a discourse that leans hard into the goals of spiritual attainment. Scholarly dependence on texts that articulate the logic of ascetic practice solely in terms of soteriology obscure the social realities of those who undertake these practices. Today, I hope to demonstrate that the bodily disciplines of Buddhist practitioners on the cremation ground, bodies that are often taken to constitute an economically unproductive or otherworldly ascetic identity, are in fact rooted in a socioeconomic identity. So anti-Weber in this way. Based on the evidence, we have to consider that this socioeconomic identity is that of the Chandala, nomenclature with a field of social meaning that basically overlaps with the impure labors of the modern Dalit outcast community, scavenging. Here we have the manual cleaning of human waste and a host of other impure labors in the modern context, which are very similar in many respects to these Chandalas in the ancient world. As I mentioned, I'll be focusing on the practice cataloged as Pamchakulika within the Buddhist canonical list of duttaguna practices. According to the Visuddhimagga, Pamchakulika is the repurposing of bits of cloth discarded in a wide range of filthy places as material for one's monastic robes. The Visuddhimagga suggests a dizzying array of locales for retrieving this discarded clothing, including garbage heaps, roadside gutters, and latrines. But crucially for our discussion, the Visuddhimagga singles out scavenging among corpses in cremation grounds as the strictest form of this Pamchakulika practice. It is this charnel ground Pamchakulika I will focus on today. When I initially encountered regulations regarding the practice of Pamchakulika in the Vinaya some years ago, my first inclination was to trust the soteriological characterization of this ascetic practice in the Visuddhimagga. Books like Reginald Ray's Buddhist Saints of India presented Pamchakulika asceticism as just a subject within the canonically acceptable list of austere soteriological practices found throughout early Buddhist literature. I just presumed that a certain very rare breed of Buddhist monastic, those eccentric individuals particularly devoted to the Buddhist path, voluntarily undertook Pamchakulika as part of a canonically required suite of extremely challenging practices. If a monastic chose to challenge themselves, they went to the canonical sources, found this list of Dudagunas, and naturally took on the responsibility of Pamchakulika along with the other practices on the list. Look up the list, do what's on the list. But when I turned away from canonical lists and dove into the Vinaya, I was surprised to find that Pamchakulika was almost never labeled a Dudaguna, an ascetic practice. In fact, Pamchakulika almost never appeared with any of the other practices on the list of Dudagunas. If this was a canonical practice for those monks challenging themselves to practice the Dudagunas, why did accounts of these practitioners not mention the other Dudagunas on the list? Moreover, I began to find legal cases in the Vinaya in which the profile of the Pamchakulika practitioner was not what I understood to be the soteriological ideal from the Visuddhimagga. That intense, hyper-masculine saint, styled as a lone wolf personality, oblivious to worldly distraction as he strives after awakening. On the contrary, what I found were bands of seemingly unscrupulous monastics systematically rooting through the cremation grounds, squabbling amongst themselves, storing up scavenged fabric, and laboring to dye and stitch together this filthy cloth in workshops I could only conceive of as part of a scavenging economy. It was these clues which piled up over years of reading Vinaya and thinking about this discourse in relationship to soteriological texts that led me to reconsider whether a Buddhist monk from any caste background, especially a Brahminical background, would ever have been expected to be a cremation ground ascetic. Part 3, talking about Vinaya. The extent to which texts framed soteriologically, like the Visuddhimagga, can obfuscate the contributions of subaltern groups to religious institutions becomes clear when we examine Pamchakulika-like practices, which appear in the Brahminical legal codes. These are legal traditions which dealt with caste in general, but also talked about outcast labor. As I've discussed these texts in detail before, I won't be going through them today, but I'll simply note that outcasts, or chandalas, as they appear in these Brahminical texts, are supposed to earn their living by scavenging for goods on the cremation ground, and crucially, that their garments are the clothing of the dead. You can see it highlighted there, 1052. It's clearly the view of the Brahminical Dharmashastra that bodies which engage in the degraded ritual behavior of scavenging for goods on the cremation ground fit into a caste-based social taxonomy. However, the scholarship within religious studies and Buddhist studies has generally not considered caste identity as a rationale for practices categorized as asceticism. As I've suggested above, I believe this hesitancy to look for socioeconomic positionality to account for asceticism has its roots in the privileging of soteriological explanations for religious practice. Why do we practice? Of course, to attain awakening. That's the primary focus, right? Not for these guys. I don't think so. In the remainder of my talk, I'll demonstrate that the Buddhist ascetic practice of Pamchakulika did indeed, as the Dharmashastra suggests, emerge within the outcast professions of the late ancient South Asian death economy. To do so, I'll identify the behaviors among Pamchakulika practitioners in Vinaya narratives that lend themselves to a phenomenology of subaltern labor, a labor that requires an economic and a ritual technical capacity. The first Vinaya passage we will examine evidences what I call the economic or acquisitive component of this subaltern governmentality. And it goes like this. At that time, there was a large group of householders who carried a corpse of one of their relatives, presumably, and put it into the cemetery, or charnel ground, as it were. There was a group of Pamshakula monks who saw this and said to the other monks, if we go get this Pamshakula fabric now, scavenge around for it, or perhaps even strip it, right, from the corpse, I think we can get a lot. The other monks said, another party of monks within their monastery said, you go by yourselves, we're not going. The monks quickly headed off and obtained a lot of Pamshakula fabric. They brought it back and were cleaning and stitching it in the monastery. One of these monks saw another who had stayed behind and said to the monk, why didn't you go with us to get all this wonderful material? We went to the cemetery and we got all of this stuff and brought it back. And that monk said, well, bring it here and split it. Since we have all this extra Pamshakula material, bring it and we'll split it. He answered, well, you didn't go with us, so we're not doing it. We're not splitting it with you. And he responded, the two monks then argued and brought this matter to the Buddha, and the Buddha, as judge, states it belongs to whoever went to get it. I define the Pamshakulika network in this Vinaya as economic, as opposed to soteriological. Soteriological in nature because the logic guiding these practitioners privileges a form of social regulation that facilitates what scholars of ancient economies have called a regime of accumulation. Vinaya narratives of this genre suggest that the accumulation of Pamshakula fabric can be broken down into roughly 4 economic modes, each of which can be seen in this passage. The first is a coordinated regime of collection of Pamshakula from the cremation ground. The monastery, other locales, it varies quite a lot. The second are strategies by which these monastics stored this fabric. Could be the cremation ground, could be the monastery, could be locales that are hidden from thieves. The third is the distribution, or lack thereof in this case, of Pamshakula fabric. This might take place at any stage in the process of repurposing this Pamshakula material. And the fourth is the process of transforming the defiled clothing scraps belonging to the bodies of the dead through a process of manufacture, yielding acceptable public attire for Buddhist monastics. The Pamshakulika monastic would have been possessed of the skill set required for properly cleaning, stitching, and dyeing fabric garnered on the cremation ground. There are many other cases that are like this which attest to this skill set. And indeed, it is precisely this skill set that our monastics demonstrate in this case we have just reviewed. The second component of Pamshakulika identity is the ritual techne required as a laborer in the death economy. So the first one was economic. The second one I'm calling a ritual techne, ritual skill set. This techne includes a wide range of skills, each of which is tied to an epistemological framework deeply rooted in the material conditions of daily life. Roughly speaking, this techne included about 3 primary skill sets. The first is an intimate knowledge of the ritual rhythms of the cremation ground. The zone of the dead in the pre-modern Indian world was culturally potent because it housed the ancestral bodies and their ghosts, connecting the living to lineages that constituted the source of their spiritual and material welfare. Meta-persons, as the great anthropologist Marshall Sahlins refers to the spirits on whom the living community depends, were the decisive agents of human weal and woe, the sources of their success or lack thereof, in all variety of endeavors from agriculture to hunting to sexual reproduction and political ambition, end quote. In other words, the living remained dependent upon the dead. This dependency was expressed in terms of a constant flow of traffic to and from the cremation ground. For this reason, the families of the dead are commonly featured in Vinaya narratives about Pamshakulikas. In addition to the traffic and relatives of the dead, the cremation ground is home to a large caste, C-A-S-T, no E, of vital functionaries, including corpse bearers, grave diggers, cremation wood dealers, cemetery guards, sellers of offerings to the dead, executioners, and of course, scavengers. The Pamshakulika practitioner had to negotiate not only the ethically fraught encounters with the relatives of the dead while scavenging, but also a potentially crowded landscape of impurity professionals vying for authority over turf in the cremation ground. The second element of the ritual techne is an understanding of how to interact with the dead while stripping the corpses of their death shrouds. You have to be versed in this kind of propriety of how to deal with the corpse. Death was not the end of a person's relationship to the world of the living, nor was it necessarily an end to the relationship with their bodies and material possessions. When the property of the dead individual was threatened, even a corpse which had not stirred for days could reanimate to protect its property. Dead persons were often exceedingly jealous of their corporeal bodies and could re-inhabit these bodies at any time, provided the bodies were still intact. Indeed, this is the implicit understanding upon which a whole genre of Vinaya case law is predicated. The Pamshakulika had to be familiar with these legal requirements and to know how to apply these principles in practice, a challenging feat requiring detailed knowledge about how the anatomy of a corpse operates in different phases of decomposition. The third and final ritual techne is perhaps unexpected as a role for the Pamshakulika. This I would call a pastoral role of a spirit medium, and this I'll have to explain in detail when we come to the case in a moment. As the recently dead spirit was regarded as a suffering being, remaining unhealthily attached to this world, the Pamshakulika played a vital social function by ritually ushering the restless spirit into the next world. The benefits of this pastoral role extended far beyond the succor given to the unhappy spirit. The problem of the restless spirit was not just a matter of consoling the pitiable emotional state of this former human. The restless spirit functioned as a kind of social virus that spread misery and misfortune to the community of the living. By ministering to the dead and thus ritually ushering them away from the world, the Pamshakulika not only provided succor to the individual spirit, but defended the community of the living against the malefaction wrought by these dangerous liminal beings. I'll be devoting the remainder of my time today to a Vinaya case that focuses on the behavior of a notorious Pamshakulika monk, Black Ananda. After reading through the case, I will highlight narrative elements within the case which I believe reinforce my argument that Pamshakulika ascetic communities, though nominally Buddhist, derive their identity primarily from their socioeconomic status in scavenging networks and their role as experts in the ritual techne required to domesticate the dead. It's a long passage here, a little small, and I'll read it out. So there was a group of householders, just like we started in the last case, whose relative had died. They brought a fine piece of white fabric, they wrapped up the corpse of their relative, and they deposited it in the cemetery, charnel ground. At that time, Ananda, not Black Ananda, but Ananda, another in this troop of Pamshakulikas, was wandering there, and as soon as he saw the fabric, he took it. The dead person stirred and said to Ananda, "Do not take my garment." Ananda came back, covered up the dead person with the fabric, and left. Ananda arrived at the Jetavada monastery and said to the monks, "At such and such a place, a dead person is covered with a piece of fine fabric." There was a monk called Black Ananda who was there, who was known as brutish and powerful, and asked Ananda, "Where is it?" Seizing upon his reply. He answered, "It's over there." And Black Ananda immediately went to get it. At that time, the dead person stirred and said to Black Ananda again, "Do not take my garment, my funeral shroud." And Black Ananda scolded him. "Petty spirit, filthy spirit, how is it possible it belongs to you? It's because you crave this garment that you are reborn as a spirit, or in some way vivified as a spirit," the language says in the Chinese. Black Ananda took the garments and ran ahead as the dead body wailed and pursued him. Black Ananda brought the cloth inside the Jetavana confines. The powerful and righteous gods and spirits of the Jetavana did not allow the petty spirit of the corpse in, blocked him. At that time, Black Ananda took the cloth, showed it to the monks, and said, "This is the garment of that dead person. I took it. I got it." A bit of pride, it seems, here. The monks asked him, "Well, where's the dead person now?" And he answered, "Well, he's in the ditch right outside." The monks were concerned about what to do about this situation, and they brought this matter up to the Buddha. The Buddha said to Black Ananda, and here comes a set of verdicts or rulings on what to do ritually. Bring that body back. Put it back in its original spot and cover it up again with the white cloth which you stole from it. When you go, you should remain in back. Don't stay in the front of the corpse. Presumably it's being carried on perhaps some kind of a bier. It's not entirely clear, but basically letting that corpse go back to the cemetery. Don't stay too close to the feet lest you be hit by him, kicked. The Buddha took up this case and said to the monks, "From now on, if a dead body has not yet decomposed, you should not take the garment. If you do so, it is a dushkrita vinaya offense." End case. So the legal problematics that generate the kind of narrative scaffolding for this case emerge from a communal drive, exemplified by the activities of Black Ananda and Ananda, to scavenge on the cremation ground for Pamchakula fabric. These are economic activities that I have labeled a regime of accumulation. We're informed at the outset that Ananda is the consummate scavenger, wandering in the cremation ground, ready to pounce upon the next opportunity to retrieve Pamchakula fabric as soon as the next corpse is deposited. The representative of this Pamchakula community, whom the audience first encounters, is Ananda. Ananda is depicted here as a kind of scout, as a sentry for his community of impure scavengers. If he can retrieve this fabric without incident, he will. But if not, he'll call for backup from his comrades. Ananda possesses the eye of a highly trained expert, stalking the terrain of the cremation ground, quickly spotting the next family transporting their relative's corpse, and then swiftly stripping the dead of their property. The reader is told that the shroud was a piece of fine white fabric, an indication that for Ananda, the value of the material in this case was a far cry from the kind of putrefying scraps of clothing he usually found, ones which were ruined by the ultra-humid conditions, shredded by animals roving in the cemetery, and of course soaked with corpse detritus. This was a clean piece of fabric, and he knew it. He had that expertise. The juridical tradition to which this case belongs is keen to emphasize that the techne required in the process of this regime, this economic regime of accumulation, is inextricably entangled with the ritual techne required for navigating the liminal terrain of the dead. A quick glance at the verdict of the case tells us that Ananda's decision to strip this particular corpse falls askew of the body of ritual techne this juridical community expects of their members. The legal principle states, if a dead body has not yet decomposed, you should not take the garment. Now, it's difficult to know whether Ananda was ignorant of the rule or whether he recognized the corpse was not decomposed and went and got it anyway because that economic imperative was so strong. Once Ananda is reprimanded by this animated corpse, however, he seems to recover his sense of propriety, a move consistent with the ritual requirements laid out in that case verdict. He returns to cover up the dead person in their funeral shroud and heads back to the Buddhist monastery. As Ananda is now fully aware that the corpse remains intact, it only makes sense that the jurist authors would at this point just conclude this legal narrative by enumerating the case verdict and correlative punishments. There's nothing else that needs to be said. However, the narrative continues as Ananda returns to the community of Pamchakulika monastics at the monastery and reports in detail on the location within the cremation ground wherein this valuable piece of fabric can be obtained. Ananda seems to have forgotten all about the consequences of violating the rules of ritual propriety, reverting instead to the profit motive and encouraging his comrades to take by force what he was unable to take by stealth. Ananda's return to the monastery prompts the introduction of another representative of this Pamchakulika community, Black Ananda. As I've noted, the presence of the subplot involving Black Ananda does not serve to advance the juridical logic of this narrative. One of the few commentators on this case, Gregory Chopin, has argued that the inclusion of Black Ananda serves only to add to the farcical character of an already outrageous and silly, frankly, story. After all, what in the world is this Buddhist monk, described in over-the-top language as ferocious and powerful, doing in a Buddhist legal narrative? What might the social significance be of a monk who comes across like a mafia enforcer, strong-arming this pitiful corpse into relinquishing its funeral shroud? The only possible meaning this episode might have, according to Chopin, is to reinforce for the reader the disgusting, lewd, and senseless nature of the Pamshakulika's existence in the monastery and in society. The behavior of Pamshakulikas, such as Black Ananda, is antisocial criminal mischief and nothing more. Indeed, Black Ananda's one-upmanship of Ananda by doubling down on the violation of the legal principle lends itself to an interpretation of this community as a group of monastics committed to ruthless and deeply offensive profit motive at the expense of a nuanced ritual techne for dealing with the dead. However, I would argue that, in his role as Pamshakulika, Black Ananda combines the culturally powerful social function of a ritual specialist together with this economic motive. Both are complementary, both can be done simultaneously. And this is, of course, contra Chopin's argument. While Chopin views Black Ananda's theft of the corpse death garments as a senseless act of antisocial behavior, I believe this model of complementarity, in which an economic and a ritual logic are operating simultaneously, best accounts for Black Ananda's seemingly pathological and frankly terrifying behavior. My own inclination is to look for deeper cultural structures that might accord with this ostensibly pointless act of sadism. In my experience, trying to reconstruct the cultural logic behind fragmentary accounts of Buddhist monastic behavior, I tend to look for anthropologies to fill in the phenomenological gaps left by narratively fragmented discourse. Eric Davis's Death Power, a recent study of Cambodian Buddhist funerary practices, is just such an anthropology. In Death Power, Eric Davis details how in contemporary funerals, the Sangha appropriates the Pamshakula of a corpse as part of a ritual intended to pacify the dangerous spirits of a dead person. While some of Davis's informants read the transfer of Pamshakula cloth to the Sangha only as a metaphor for monastic control over these volatile and threatening entities, there were other voices who suggested the death shroud was in fact the literal vessel of the dead spirit. This meant that the monastic ritual specialist was responsible for the domestication of dangerous ancestral spirits by means of appropriating their death shroud. Should the monastic institution fail to appropriate the Pamshakula cloth, the spirit would continue to wreak havoc upon the world of the living by damaging crops, spreading illness, attacking children in their vulnerable stages, and creating strife within families. In our case about the Pamshakulika, there is no explicit reference to the ensoulment of the death fabric by the spirit associated with this corpse, nor is there any stated concern that these cremation ground ascetics must perform a ritual that was isomorphic with what we see in this contemporary Cambodian Sangha. However, the relationship between the bodies of Black Ananda and the corpse's spirit are animated by a currency, this currency of the death fabric, the Pamshakula. Before stripping the corpse of its funerary shroud, Black Ananda scolded the spirit. Petty spirit, filthy spirit, how is it possible it belongs to you? It's because you crave this garment that you are reborn as a spirit. Black Ananda's actions are liable to interpretation as pathological cruelty. But this discursive formulation is in fact representative of the kind of sermonizing that is required by monastic ritual specialists in the Cambodian context. Black Ananda is providing, I argue, pastoral counsel to a suffering spirit, although I would say in the gruffest manner possible. Here I would like to note that there are precedents for these pastoral relationships with spirits among cremation ground ascetics. Elsewhere in the Vinaya, monastics are advised to preach the Dharma to liberate restless spirits they encounter on the cremation ground. Here's just one example that comes from the Vinaya, where a monk who is on the cremation ground practicing asceticism is advised that if you encounter ghosts and they wish to hear the sutras, the gathas, and the Dharma, then you should comply. You should sermonize to the restless spirits you encounter in the cremation ground. The spirit identifies with this death shroud to the extent that Black Ananda's response is to state the classic Buddhist truth that selfhood is constituted only by a perverse attachment to the objects with which one identifies. By stripping that ghost of his funeral shroud, Black Ananda plays the role of ritual specialist, I argue, removing the impediment to the spirit's liberation while simultaneously turning a prophet. Here, our phenomenology of the dead body, the Pamshakulika body, and the death shroud, all three together, make evident a social logic that I would argue is simultaneously ritual and economic. The parallels between the Black Ananda Vinaya narrative and the modern Pamshakulika rituals in Cambodia suggest a radical departure from Chopin's assessment of the social utility of cremation ground asceticism. The most prominent difference is that the Cambodian monastic ritual specialists are viewed with reverence, while the Pamshakulikas of the Vinaya, represented by Black Ananda, are viewed by at least some monastic authorities and members of the public as antisocial, as bizarre, even dangerous figures. But according to Davis, displaying fearlessness while undertaking the ritual appropriation of the dead person's Pamshakula is read by the Cambodian public as a sign of the monastic's righteous power and authority. Quote, "Fearlessness in the face of death is an institutional, though not individual, component of monastic identity and a component of the Sangha's authority everywhere Buddhism is found." End quote. The extreme cathecting of social anxiety onto Black Ananda, concretized in the highly ambivalent depictions in the Vinaya, is due, I'd argue, to the Pamshakulika's highly informal, vernacular, and almost certainly subaltern form of spiritual mediumship. There are many wonderful volumes of post-colonial anthropology in recent years which document a phenomenology of subaltern spiritual mediumship, which may help account for the antisocial, tempestuous, and even criminal behavior of Pamshakulikas such as Black Ananda. In her Anthropology of the Garifuna people of the Caribbean, Marcella Perdomo outlines a phenomenology of subaltern mediumship which is based not on institutional authority, but on a deeply personal charisma generated through the psychological and physical trauma of spirit possession. In contrast to the well-established institutional mode of domestication of the dead in contemporary Cambodia, the personal nature of subaltern mediumship means that those individuals who engage the spirits, and ideally tame them, are vulnerable to dissociative forms of spirit possession that deeply unsettle their roles in family and community. Perdomo notes that many of her informants experienced intense scenes of spirit possession that would often take on a violent character. But while Chopin reads this socially dangerous behavior of the Pamshakulika as devoid of social significance, Perdomo explains that these bouts of violent madness serve as indicators that an individual has begun the process of determining how best to fulfill what is essentially their responsibility to their community of spiritual mediumship. Once the process of initiation into spiritual mediumship is complete, the individual attains a degree of ritual expertise that allows for more personal control during this encounter with the spirit. The greater the degree of expertise, the less the medium is likely to fall into full possession, a kind of dissociative experience that is most likely to lead to expressions of violence and antisocial behavior. The ideal, according to Perdomo, is to engage the spirit in a state of partial possession. This still invites tremendous psychological and physical risk to that spiritual medium, but by resisting full possession, the medium simultaneously avoids social stigma of total personal breakdown while gaining control over the chaotic spirit. I've already noted at several points that Chopin does not read the behavior of Black Ananda as that of a ritual specialist of any kind. For Chopin, the asceticism of Black Ananda precludes any ritual role, and he is certainly not a pastoral presence for a wider community. My concern with this approach is that it seems to follow too closely the representation of the Pamshakulika community by a Brahminically oriented monastic jurist, one who is perforce a hostile witness to the subaltern monks in their midst. In his methodological meditations on how to recover the heretical Christian cosmologies of Italian peasants that were dragged before the Inquisition, the historian of vernacular medieval religion Carlo Ginzburg refers to inquisitors tragicomically as anthropologists. By doing so, he is making two complementary claims. Hegemonic power structures often provide invaluable data on subaltern communities, even as they simultaneously render those customs of their subjects absurd, antisocial, and even dangerous to the cosmic order. Homi Bhabha, in his analysis of how suppressed subaltern discourse appears within the Indian colonial archive, also testifies to this dual function of hegemonic anthropology. On the one hand, the anthropology of the colonial archive has generally reflected the view from the perspective of elites, that the subaltern social practices could only ever be absurd, perverse, uncivilized. On the other hand, this epistemological framework never becomes a totalizing discourse that is wished for by hegemonic power. Rather, these archives are punctuated by moments that have become, in the post-colonial parlance, hybrid, indicating that the presence of the subaltern other always remains a haunting presence, expressed in the over-the-top language of monstrosity and farce. I believe our representation of Black Ananda by the Vinaya jurists should be treated as a kind of colonial anthropology, inasmuch as these monastic authorities were capable of seeing Pamshakulikas only through the lens of an increasingly hegemonic, Brahmanizing governmentality. So, what is a better model for categorizing Black Ananda and the Pamshakulikas? Here, I'd like to complement the work of Eric Davis and Marcella Perdomo with a final model of anthropology for the outcast subaltern priest exorcist who is discussed in Lawrence Babb's now classic study, Popular Hinduism in Central India. So I'll just read a very, very short passage from that and then conclude. Babb describes a figure called the Baiga. The Baiga, like the Brahmin priest, uses a special kind of knowledge for the benefit of his clients. The Baiga has knowledge of special mantras, which give him access to and a degree of control over certain benevolent and harmful deities and spirits. The Baiga knows how to deal with human problems, particularly illness, that stem from misalignments of human relationships with these spirits. Yet to this, an important qualification must be added. While informants insist that his knowledge of mantras lies at the basis of the Baiga's powers, it is equally clear that the Baiga's professional efficacy as a spirit medium, his power in the eyes of his clients, depends upon factors that have largely to do with the imponderables of individual personality. The successful Baiga, spirit medium, with a large and flourishing clientele, seems to radiate an aura of easy familiarity with the world of gods and goddesses and malevolent spirits. He seems to have a reassuring confidence in his ability to deal with matters that produce awe and fear in his clientele. A Baiga's success in his calling seems to depend far more on these aspects of character than formal qualifications. I believe the ritual labor of the Baiga spirit medium in the context of contemporary India is a particularly valuable model for thinking about the figure of Black Ananda and what this figure meant to the broader culture of late antique South Asia. Fear and awe is what the Baiga inspires in his clientele. Right? He scares the crap out of them, right? I'd like to conclude today by first reviewing Chopin's view of the meaning of Pamchakulika asceticism to the Buddhist monastery and Indian society more generally. I'll then quickly summarize the evidence I reviewed in the presentation, which I believe supports my view that the asceticism of Pamchakulikas should be defined first and foremost not as a Buddhist soteriological project, but as a set of non-Buddhist ritual and economic labors performed by subalterns or outcasts within the late antique South Asian death economy. In his article, Cross-Dressing with the Dead, Chopin states repeatedly that Pamchakulika practices are socially dangerous, suggesting that for late antique Indian societies, cremation ground practices had no social value, save as a threat to the proper ordering of society. The only value of cremation ground practices lies in the specifically ascetic experience of power that comes with being in contact with the dead. And this is cast primarily in terms of a kind of ascetic daring do, ascetics as the extreme sportsmen of early South Asia. I'll close here with a set of sort of summary extracts which I believe explain why it is the texts I've discussed today point to a very different conclusion. First, in the course of their practices, Pamchakulikas will encounter spirits in the cremation ground, and these monastics are obviously familiar with the patterns or ways of the spirits. This is indicated not only in the Black Ananda case, but across multiple Vinaya cases involving this kind of asceticism. And we know from the Vinaya and contemporary anthropology that these spirits are potentially extremely dangerous to the community of the living. We have also learned from Eric Davis that there is a long tradition of viewing the corpse shroud as a kind of ritual currency of spiritual power. This to me suggests a pastoral role for Black Ananda, though it's not articulated explicitly in our case. 3. Perhaps the most difficult to interpret is the monstrous and even criminal disposition of Black Ananda. As I've suggested, the essential cultural function of subaltern practices tends to be distorted or written out of colonial anthropologies. If we read against the grain of what I suggest as a colonial anthropology, I believe we discover a powerful cultural logic driving Black Ananda's behavior toward the spirit. In strong contrast to Davis's Cambodian ritual specialists, Marcella Perdomo makes clear that we should not expect the confrontation of the spirit medium with the dead to be a clean interaction. The interaction of the spirit medium and the ghost often leads to messy and even dangerous social consequences for the entire community. 4. In this talk, I've drawn upon a sort of phenomenology of labor, of ritual and economic labor, to be specific, in order to articulate the contours of a figure that could easily be discarded as ahistorical, monstrous, or simply irrelevant to the world if the colonial anthropology of the Brahminically oriented monastics were to be believed. I hope that my examination today of these two Vinayas has been persuasive, and that the Pamchakulikas look now more like an historical presence and not a mere discursive oddity in Buddhist legal literature. Finally, I hope I have persuaded the audience that the social meaning of asceticism, at least the Pamchakulika cremation ground asceticism, should be understood not as some perverse brand of soteriological impulse. On the contrary, I hope we can shift our interpretive lens to see the Pamchakulikas as a product of socioeconomic context, initially found outside of the Buddhist monastic institution, one that is intimately connected with outcast labor in the death economy. Thank you all very much for your time. Appreciate it. Okay.
You need to take questions?
Yes.
Can I start with one?
You can.
All right, I have a number. I found a lot of that very stimulating and sparking thoughts in all kinds of directions. But a number of questions are raised. And one is a methodological one about the reading of Vinaya stories. And it sounds from your presentation tonight as though you're reading them as some reflection of what actually happened.
Yes.
But I'm sure you have a kind of more reasoned justification for how they should be treated, whether as simply narrative discourse or something else. It sounds like you're reading through them to a historical and class reality. And I guess there would be some pushback against that from certain quarters.
Oh, of course.
Yes, anyway.
Yes. Is this history? Can you do history with these or not? Yeah. The answer is absolutely. Absolutely, it's the case. At times it's extremely difficult, but I think that when there's a level of specificity, for example, where is this taking place? Is it on the cremation ground or not? Were there cremation grounds? Yes. We know that for a fact. You can triangulate with all kinds of other evidence. Was there a caste system? Yes, there was. Then there becomes more problematic elements, right? So we can do history like that just by talking about places, practices, which I think there's wide agreement on. Now the question of what a Buddhist monk was doing at a particular place in time, that's harder to pin down, right? And so I think you stick with a longue durée and you say, okay, look, this is several hundred years. When? We don't know. We just don't know. But if it corresponds to what's going on in Dharma Shastra, which it seems to, and I think even people in some quarters would agree with that, if it corresponds with what's going on in Dharma Shastra and other traditions as well, then I think that you can start to see, well, I think we're talking about early centuries of the Common Era, and we can start to get a little bit more specific with what's going on. Most challenging for me in doing, so I think you can do history. But I think the challenge for me is where precisely caste intersects with Buddhist identity. And can these stories really tell us something about that? I am not sure. This was my attempt to try my best to get a sense of that. But given the proliferation of this kind of discourse, and given the fact that I think demographically we should not presume that most monks were Brahmins or upper caste, given that that's the case, and by the way, there's so many wonderful parallels to this that we have historical evidence for, of religion being a motivating force for individuals who are sitting low on a social hierarchy and allowing them to leapfrog social barriers that they have. There's a wonderful book on Christianity among enslaved Afro-Caribbeans and how it is that Christianity became this very powerful, not just discursive tool, but actual social institution that allowed the leapfrogging to push for anti-slavery movements. Where did that come from, right? The rhetoric was powerful to certain social groups, and so I think there's a logic there that makes it so that we should expect those who hear a message that is some version of egalitarianism, it's complicated with the Buddhist tradition, of course, but some version of that to be motivated to join that kind of a group. And the vast majority of people who already sit at the top of the food chain to not participate. In fact, you can see many historical examples where that's precisely not the case. So if we look at those parallels, I think we can start to see that what's going on that's difficult to understand in the story has lots of other anthropological analogies. And based on that, plus the triangulation of evidence from other traditions, Dharma Shastra, etc., I think that we have a pretty good case that history can be made out of these traditions. Now, reading Black Ananda specifically in this case as an historical figure, no, of course, he's not a historical figure. But does he represent that scary subaltern other for those Vinaya authorities? There are many examples of this kind of exaggerated, monstrous, farcical rhetoric, which some people will write off and just say, well, it's ahistorical or it's a joke or what have you. I don't think that's the case. The way that untouchables are described by British colonial authorities, shockingly similar. They do these absurd things. Here they all are. And some of them will be true and some will not. But the monstrous discourse that farcical discourse is very consistent. So looking at this from this, Homi Bhabha talks about a kind of space of hybridity. I think we can look at anthropological examples that help fill in the gaps, to help make this more and more like a history, though of course pinning it down in any really, really specific way. This time, this place, or even this place in India, of course we can't do that yet. But in short, I think it is representative of historical orientations, realities. Yes?
On the question of Buddhist identity that you mentioned, do the Vinaya cases involving the Panchakulikas, do they discuss other rival sectarian Panchakulika groups that could, in discussing these other groups, give us some idea of what the Buddhists held to be most important?
You mean, do they name like Ajivikas or whatever? Or do they?
Yeah.
Yeah, no.
No.
The Vinaya, and these guys appear, I think there's something on the order of 70 to 100 quotations that you can find from all Vinaya where these guys appear, which is a lot, but it's still tiny compared to the kind of data you would like to have.
Yeah.
I think it's enough to say they exist, but things like referencing them in relationship to other subaltern groups who are monastics, or to groups that were early Hindu, whatever you want to call it, there's nothing like that. And in fact, precisely because of this rhetoric of monstrosity, silliness, absurdity, the way they're cataloged by the elite Vinaya jurist authors, it precludes that, because they never took them seriously to begin with. It's precisely that kind of rhetoric that makes them seem so absurd, even ahistorical. They didn't really exist, right? This never really existed, right? Buddhism was never really cremation ground ascetics, right? Maybe at the beginning, some weird people, right? But that certainly wasn't a fundamental part of the order. And the reason why people came to that conclusion, I think, is because the rhetoric is so absurd and so contextless, in that it doesn't bring up these other figures. I'd love to see it, though. It doesn't exist, that I know of. Yeah, John.
Yeah, I mean, part of me wants to ask you for a little mini lecture on Buddhism and caste, but maybe that's for later. So instead, maybe you can help me think of how Gregory Chopin would respond to your talk if he hasn't already. And I thought one way he might respond is by basically accepting a lot of what you say, which is that the story is a critique of ritual specialists as brutish and absurd and hypocritical and venal, and they're so greedy for the cloth they'll strip it off the corpse before the spirit has had a chance to leave the corpse, and they're so hypocritical they'll even give a little sermon on attachment in order to get what they want. But the point of the story is, in the end, the Buddha says, enough of this, put the cloth back on the corpse and leave it alone. So if you want to play Carlo Ginzburg and reconstruct the value of the ritual specialist and what they're doing in society, that's fine, but that's not what the story's doing, that's not what the Buddha's doing, that's not the Buddhist attitude. Right.
Well, actually, I have John to blame for this entire argument because you introduced me to Carlo Ginzburg. Yeah, so the capstone narratively is don't do it, right? So if the capstone narratively is don't do it, then what would we conclude? That it didn't happen? That it happened a little bit? How much is that capstone how important is it supposed to be in doing history? And I would argue almost not at all. Almost not at all, especially in the ancient world. Who followed any rules, right? The Romans published endless rules. Who followed any of those rules? Nobody, especially if they weren't being policed in some way by the state. These rules are meaningless for the most part, I think. And Amy Langenberg's work on the Bhikshuni Sangha is really inspiring in this way. People made it up. And that's why I use the word vernacular. It could have been a guideline, could have heard it from somewhere else. They might have tried in some way to do it, Or they could have simply discarded it, depending on the community you were in, or never heard of it in the first place. So to my mind, it's much more powerful to look at these phenomenologies, these descriptions, essentially, of behavior, and see whether or not they can be pegged to historical indicators as best as possible. And the rules, I think, are interesting and helpful, and they can be helpful in instructing us and guiding us. But I think it's the narrative description that is much more fruitful than any narrative capstone. And Gregory Chopin, I think you're right. In his work, he has looked primarily at the rules and not thought as much about the communities who are breaking those rules. But I think in the ancient world, in Buddhist monasteries, people mostly broke the rules. Didn't keep them, or didn't even know about them, for that matter. That would be my response. What do you think? I'm sorry, did I see your hand?
Oh, yeah. Thank you so much for this talk. I also think a lot about kind of the death internal economies of early Buddhism, Indian Buddhism. And I'm wondering, have you found similar patterns in the Vinaya cases that you look at with other kind of extractive strategies? Because a lot of these corpses are later used in parts or in wholes as like key ritual ingredients. So why did you focus on the fabric collectors as opposed to other like cemetery eternal scavengers?
I know. Well, there's a whole discussion I think we could have about whether or not this is proto-tantric, for example, and there's so much going on in later texts which you just don't find much of it here. For example, I have a few passages which suggest using the corpse for medicinal purposes. The later tantric stuff, you find it all the time. But there's only a few in the Vinaya where there's references to it, and they're so skeletal, no pun intended, right? I mean, it's very limited, and it's very, very frustrating. But I think actually looking at this in relationship to tantric stuff later, you can actually help to think about what might have been going on in some of these, subdisciplines of corpseology. Medicine, the robes, obviously, there's a lot of the robe stuff, so I end up focusing on it way too much. But there's a whole lot of other stuff going on there, I think, as well. If you use Tantra and Dharmashastra as well, I think we can actually label a whole bunch of subdisciplines. The corpse was an incredibly powerful element in this world, and because of our own sanitized conceptions of what happens at death, we really culturally, I think, miss it totally. And the cremation ground also was a place of tremendous wealth. You see the guys mining the beach, right, for this and that? The cremation ground was way more important, right? And there's tons of gold just sitting around in there, right? So I once referred to the cremation ground as an emporium, which it absolutely is, even today to a certain extent, depending on which ones you go to. So I think there's a lot of fruitful opportunities, especially with the tantric stuff and then looking backwards. But it's a huge challenge to do that. I'm glad you're working on that. Yeah.
Okay. So,
Yes, okay.
Somebody else? I've already asked a question. Is it?
No, I didn't see
Okay.
another.
All right. So, I'm sympathetic to this new way of looking at it as a kind of intrusion from the outside of a caste economic practice into the Buddhist Sangha, rather than driven from the inside by what you call the soteriological project. So, if we accept that, what do you see as aspects of the practice that are not, in fact, there's no evidence on the outside for it? For example, not just taking the cloth, but making it into robes, restitching it, re-dyeing it. Is that an exclusively Buddhist practice, or does that also have analogues in the subaltern low caste economy that's going on outside?
Yes. So actually, stitching and dyeing, like that kind of terminology, it's really Buddhist. But in terms of taking fabric, clothing, shrouds, from the cremation ground and presumably using them or selling them, that is in Dharma Shastra. And Chandalas are doing it according to the Dharma Shastra jurists. Multiple Dharma Shastras talk about that. So it seems that they think it's happening among outcast groups who perform a number of different functions within the cremation ground or in that economy.
So is it only Buddhist monastics, ascetics, who wear stitched robes of this kind? Or do other ascetic groups also participate in this kind of practice?
That is a great question. I remember thinking about that before and looking it up and looking through the Jain Vinaya actually. My guess, my thinking, if I can remember correctly, is yes, but I have to go and double check. So are there other people doing it? There's not, as far as I know, there's not that much evidence outside of these, it's mainly the Jain tradition, but we have evidence for it in the socioeconomic context of the Dharma Shastra, which is not talking at all about whatever religion, sanghas of any kind. But it's, if I recall correctly, we got the Buddhist evidence, we've got the Dharma Shastra evidence from the socioeconomic context, and then we have it in the Jain context, I think, but I definitely have to go back and check. And I think I might have even seen references to other monks from from non-Buddhist groups doing it too. But I definitely have to go back and check. I'm not sure.
That, if you could find that, that would strengthen your argument.
Yes. Yes, definitely.
But I'm particularly struck by the notion from Davis of the corpse shroud as ritual currency.
Right.
Because cloth is currency. You pay taxes in cloth in the ancient
Yes.
world and so on. So it has somewhat more meaning and weight than it has, for example, from our perspective.
Oh, definitely. Yeah, definitely. And this is why I wanted to, I mean, people who are working, there are a whole bunch of people working in the Mediterranean on ancient economics and thinking about so-called religious orders of various kinds and how they intersect with ancient economics. And they're very keen to get rid of sort of contemporary, the importing of contemporary notions of capitalist profit back into the ancient world and rethinking currency from the ground up. And as you say, I think that we need to rethink what currency means. It will change the way we understand the value systems that are at work in the material economies in the Buddhist, among Buddhist population, Buddhist Sangha populations, I think. Robes being the best example. Yeah.
I have a methodological question. When you're developing your distinction from Chopin on this Vinaya passage, it was really helpful for me when you used the word, or we referred to cathextion.
I saw you nodding.
Cathexis. I'm always really curious when people invoke theoretical terminology in Buddhist studies discourse. And I was just curious if that word comes into your thinking through these issues from Bab, from Abba. Like,
Cathextion?
yeah.
Freud.
Yeah.
Freud, Deleuze and Guattari. That's where that language comes from. I'd never seen maybe Alan Cole's work. Other than that, I can't think of anybody else that I remember using that type of terminology.
Is it useful for you in imagining a different kind of affective economy?
Yes.
From what Chopin has suggested?
Yes.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. In taking it, I mean, Freud and neo-Freudian stuff, it's gotten a bad name in humanities in general, although there's a bit of resurgence now.
Mm-hmm.
But in general, it's been discarded. And I think it's really a mistake to do that because people are weird. People are really, 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 really weird. And they're deeply weird. And in the ancient world, you don't have the policing structures that you have nowadays. I mean, what happened in families? There's no social services. to come in and tell you what to do. And what happened in families exactly? I mean, Foucault talks about this, right? And he talks about what the modern social institutions have done to us. And they've neutered our weirdness to a large degree. What was possible back then? You read the Vinaya and you're like, wow. And you're like, okay, maybe somebody's making this up, but geez, even the fact they made it up is weird, right? So I think that Freudian insight is so powerful, even though he's like the supreme modern, right? But he is channeling something from his reading of the Greeks, and these classical texts where he was looking at the marginalia of how power worked in the ancient world. And I think he imported that in his analyses. He's like, hey, modern man, you're not so civilized as you think. And it's difficult, of course, to go from the literary sensibilities of a Freudian orientation and that deeply affective sense to doing history. It's so hard. But for me, I don't know, I just couldn't make heads or tails of what was being said if I didn't try to take it more seriously, affect as related to history. But the weirdness is the connection and the perversity that's very, very deep in, our minds are malleable and multiple. We don't even have control of them. Hey, Buddhism, right? So why should our texts, our historical practices be any less strange? And so the possibilities created by thinking through Freudian discourse like cathextion and and Chopin does talk about social anxiety. He talks all about it, but he's only talking about one particular dimension, assuming everybody is some kind of bourgeois Brahmin, right? What about everybody else?
Yeah, what seemed valuable about that term here is just that it opens up a whole vision of the Sangha as, structured and kind of having an affective economy, much like the relationships between parts of the conscious individual. And that seems so much more sophisticated than, for instance, Chopin's conclusion.
But to be fair, of course, the business, thinking about the monastery as a business is a huge innovation, and it changed everybody's view. So I think his contribution is it's still absolutely central and a good starting point.
For sure, yeah. Thank you.
I was wondering, I know there's a lot of limitations when it comes to speculating like historical realities for communities where the evidence is so fragmentary, but apart from karmic demerits, what kind of punitive systems do you think were in place for these kind of transgressions? I mean, this story to me just read of the havoc one would reap upon themselves for excessive greed. As John said, just taking a funerary shroud off a corpse that wasn't even a fresh corpse. So what kind of punitive structures were in place, and how are you able to speculate on that with this kind of evidence that you look at?
Yeah, well, I appreciate that question. It's something I've sort of struggled a lot with for a long time, but I didn't talk about this today at all, but I suspect that within the Vinaya, there are lots of constituencies. They could be Pamshakulakas, or they could be Brahmins, they could be all kinds of different people. And for we know for men and women, there are different constituencies creating these texts, right? So there's all these different constituencies that I think were producing vernacular Vinayas. At some point, of course, you get a lot of uniformity. But early on, it couldn't have been uniform. There's nothing coming down from the Buddha's mouth, right, into the communities, right? These are scattered communities, often disconnected from one another. And I suspect that there were many chunks of what we now have as the Vinaya. Who knows how much it was lost, of course. But at any rate, there would have been chunks which may have made it into the Vinaya scattershot. These Pamchakulika related Vinaya cases are all over the place. They're not in one place. So the way that they ended up getting organized, it's a little hard to know exactly how all that happened, but it seems to me that there were people at some point, there were one or more communities who were thinking about the issue of Pamchakulikas, and they were making Vinayas that were specifically responses to that situation, as opposed to a blanket kibosh, no, don't do this ever, why are we even talking about this, you're so bad. There's very little like that. There's the ones on the Pamchakulikas, they tend to be specific answers, verdicts to deal with specific questions. All of them presume people are going to do Pamchakulika. It's all presumed that. So what I would suggest in this case is there's something like a Pamchakulika Vinaya. And it got scattered to the wind and made its way into various different places in the canonized version that we have now. But there must have been communities who were writing Vinaya for themselves, and for whom they didn't care what the Brahmins said, or what certain Brahmins said, who were very, very, you can see in other places, those Brahmanical constituencies, it's very clear that they were writing those Vinayas for somebody who's going to be a proper Brahmin. So I think that we have to talk about Vinaya as also emergent and vernacular. And it's difficult to do because all we have is this canonical thing, which is mostly duplicated throughout the traditions. But just because it's difficult to find and there's very few of them, I think we should still assume that there are vernacular Vinayas, multiple Vinayas from multiple communities with multiple orientations, castes, genders, etc.
Just further along those lines,
Yes.
Is there any possibility that the Pamchakulika group are just unworthy of donations of robes, or that they could perhaps just be this subaltern group that just aren't receiving enough? And perhaps they're just scavenging for robes because they just need them.
Yeah, there's evidence of that. So there is evidence of that, that's right. And you find this among you used to find this more so, it's less of a problem now, but 20, 25 years ago, 30, 40 years ago, there were a lot of Ambedkarite monks who couldn't make it through begging, right? And there's a whole discourse of like, hey, these guys aren't real monks, right? I encountered it even when I was in India. So yeah, it's out there, right? Who's worthy and who's not? And are these guys